All right, good morning, everyone. Hope everybody is well today. And
Pope's here, you can start.
oh yeah, Pope's here. We can finally get started with the class. And I'm sure everybody who will watch this by video will be glad that Pope's here. So yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, get it. Yeah. As Matt noted this morning, we will begin Sunday school next Sunday at regular time. Gary will be teaching for us next week. And, Pope's got something to say about every one of us. You know that. Yeah, I've just noticed that. Yeah. So we'll be here in this room, regular time, next Sunday, and going on from there till whatever else has to happen happens. And it'll be good to be back at regular time, I guess, again, although we've been going for about an hour. Whereas next week we'll have like 45 minutes, so, 9:30. Yeah, remember that? Yeah. You know I won't. You know I won't. All right, so we're going to pick up with Daniel, chapter 2, verse 19. But we had a great discussion to begin class last week. Any questions, comments, statements about our discussion last week as we got into chapter 2 that you'd like to either revisit or make note of in class? We got down to where Daniel he's made a request before Nebuchadnezzar to give him a little time, and he'll interpret the dream to him, verse 16. And Daniel returned to his house, verse 17, explained the matter to his friends, and he urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And it's interesting, we talked about it last week, but it's just interesting to know that, we're already told that God was going to bless Daniel with the ability to understand dreams and visions. But as we've noted time and again, the operations of the Holy Spirit belong to him. Daniel realized that, this wasn't something that he had within him and he could turn on and off just as he wanted. And I think the wording is really interesting. Verse 18, he urged his friends to plead for mercy. Daniel wasn't sure. He couldn't just assume, okay, we got this, boys, let's talk about it a little bit, and then we'll go in and talk to Nebuchadnezzar. No, he said, we've got to plead for God's mercy to show us what is going on here. So even though God had blessed Daniel realized that he couldn't take this for granted. He couldn't, just assume that God was always going to tell him everything just in the moment. Now, there were times that he did. But this was one time where Daniel knew he had to seek the Lord for this. And during the night, verse 19, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we ask of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king." So it's interesting as you look into this that the vision in the dream seemed to be revealed to Daniel. Now he said us in verse 23. But it really seemed, verse 19 says, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. So why wasn't it revealed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Azariah, Mishael, and Yeah, it's really that simple. God revealed it to Daniel.
Well, has God ever given a group vision before the Bible, or is it always just a singular person?
Right off the top of my head, no. That I could remember, no. That he has spoken to a group, but the vision always is centered in one individual of his own choosing. And, oftentimes when, being good Baptists like we are, if somebody else gets praised for something, well, I can do just as good as he could. I could do just as good as she could. Why in the world? Why does God always choose her? But you don't see any of that here. And this is the maturity of these young men. They realize, okay, this is Daniel's. We're going to pray for Daniel. We're going to uphold him. We're going to seek the God of heaven and earth for mercy to reveal this. And he gives it to Daniel, and we're good. That's spiritual maturity. That's a realization that, I don't need to be jealous of what God does. Daniel's got to go in front of the king. I ain't got to go. That could be, they're going to have their turn. In chapter 3, they're really going to have their turn. But it's maturity to realize that if God chooses someone, if God uses someone, that doesn't mean we're less than that other person. It just simply means that's who God has chosen. And that's his business to choose whom he will choose to operate through, So verses 22 through 23 record the praise offered by Daniel. And several interesting statements are made here. He says that wisdom and power are his. Wisdom from God's knowledge of the dream of this pagan king, and power from the message of God's sovereignty over the course of this world is what Daniel's talking about here. And he says, wisdom and power of yours, and Lord, Daniel's been given the dream, so we've not been told what the dream is yet. But he says, evident from what God had given him, he changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. And we've talked about this before, but one commentator notes that God determines when in history events are to take place and how long each process or phase in history is to endure. And Daniel's realizing from seeing what God has revealed him about this dream, God sets up leaders, he sets up countries, he deposes leaders, he deposes countries, he does away with them. And it all is part of his leadership of events in this world. So it's often interesting to think that there were a lot of other peoples and nations, countries in the world at that time, not just this little group. Why didn't God talk about these folks? Why didn't God talk about the Chinese? Why didn't God talk about the Inca or the Aztec that were during this time? He didn't even talk about the upcoming empire of Rome at this time. They had been founded in 7-something BC. So they were beginning to come on the scene. He's going to. But what is it? Why is it that God brings and deals with the countries? Why did he deal with the countries? How you like that for artwork? Michelangelo ain't got nothing on me. You know what I'm saying? Why is it that he dealt with these kingdoms and didn't talk about others? That's true. But why not? Why didn't he?
Well, aren't these the ones that affected people here?
There it is, right there. Nations are important. only, and there's two reasons here, but this is the first, only as they impact, I know you can't read this, God's will for his, and I'm going to say nation, because when you say his people, you know, we think about Gentiles and all this, but for his nation. There were other kingdoms going on in the world at the same time, but these were the only ones that were relevant to God's work with his people. And the value of nations is found in their relevance to God's plan for Israel. They are the chosen nation. All other nations, and we'll bring it into today's world, all other nations serve a purpose for Israel. And as they move into God's providential plan working for his nation, they are relevant, they are important. As they move out of that, they are no longer relevant and important, and they may rise and fall because their relevance to Israel is no longer the primary thing. And that says something for our nation as well. Our relevance really hinges to a great deal, not on who's sitting in the White House, but how are we relevant in God's work for Israel. And it could be, as we move into the end times, America no longer is relevant. And if that does happen, we'll go the way of these kingdoms. We'll pass off the scene. And we could see that within our own lifetime. I mean, it's just, could be, yeah, could be. I read a book by a gentleman named Robert Kaplan. If you get a chance to read any of his stuff, smart guy. And he wrote this in the 90s, so you're talking nearly 30 years ago, about how our nation was geopolitically separated. How there were some parts of America back in the 90s that were more concerned about what was happening overseas than they were about what was happening in Washington, because they were more linked commercially, trade, business, and so forth with other places. And he actually talked about situations that could arise in America where we would basically become, in essence, a failed state. But we would reach a place to where there were certain sections of our country that would actually align itself with other nations, because there was so many of a population, or there was such a connection with trade and finance. I mean, it's hard to even think that could be possible in this country. But he was identifying things that he was seeing and hearing in the 90s. And I think we're seeing some of that type of stuff actually taking place. Minnesota, California, Oregon, Washington. Yeah. Much more concerned about maybe China and Southeast Asia than they are about Washington. You know, as far as connection, as far as their relevance in trade, and money, and so forth, more concerned about that. Southwestern United States, more concerned about what's going on in Mexico and South America than they are so much about Washington. They fuss about Washington, but they're connected, perhaps more so with others. I mean, it's really weird to even think about that. But, you know, are we as a nation relevant to Israel? If we're not, anything is possible for our country. And the other thing about nations and peoples is the events of history were preparatory to the coming of Jesus in Bethlehem and his crushing the serpent's head in salvation. And from that time, events have been important in the world only as they are preparing for the final crushing of Antichrist and the establishment of God's kingdom on the earth. So when you look at history from the fall to the coming of Jesus Christ, it was all preparation for that moment. From his time, from his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, now it's looking for the ultimate or the second coming of Christ and the establishment of his kingdom. That's what that says. His kingdom on earth. So all that is happening with nations is looking and moving in preparation for what is going to come to pass. So it's just interesting, and out of all of that, during the millennium, it will be Israel. That will be the supreme nation. There will be other nations, but it will be Israel. If you read Zechariah 14, the city of Jerusalem itself is actually topographically, physically uplifted. And nations come up to Jerusalem to worship during the millennium. So it's just interesting as you look at this. When Daniel said, you set up kings and you take them down and you change times and seasons, the things that work for your plans, that was a powerful revelation that was given to Daniel with this. And he says he gives wisdom to the wise, knowledge to the discerning, those who believe his word, which is what they had done. That's why they wouldn't eat the king's meat nor drink his wine. They were grounded in the word of the Old Testament. And that gave them discernment, gave them wisdom, gave them leadership. And he says God knows the deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness. He knows what we don't know about tomorrow, next week, next year, November, if there is one, All of that, he knows what that is. And he will give us wisdom and discernment as believers to know how to follow him through it. And that's the big thing, following him through it. That's what these four guys right here were experiencing. How do we go through it and still serve God? Interesting. Comments, questions? I know I'm not sounding like a Republican or Democrat up here, but because really both parties serve the same devil. Just saying. The only thing that's relevant is your relationship with Christ. That's the important thing. So, Daniel, verse 24, goes to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon. No, that was still, that was still the ongoing decree here. And said to him, don't do this. Don't execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king and I will interpret. So Arioch took Daniel to the king and he said, I found a man. You kind of get the feeling either Arioch didn't know Daniel had already been before the king, or Arioch is trying to, look who I found, Nebuchadnezzar. Don't forget that I found this guy right here trying to take a little credit. Huh?
Daniel, I hope you're right.
Yeah, Daniel, you better be right, son, So Daniel goes before the king. And look at the second. He tells Arioch, don't execute the wise men. This was an ideal chance for Daniel to wipe the slate clean. All these other wise men and astrologers, sorcerers, magicians, all pagans, idolaters. He could have allowed it just be wiped clean, but he exhibited care for the lives of others.
And the same guy is going to turn right around and plot to get rid of Daniel.
Yeah.
These guys ought to be grateful.
Yeah. Yeah.
But instead, they were hateful.
Mm-hmm.
They were envious.
Yeah. They have to be church people or something like that. I mean, you know. And I are one, so I can say that. You know, I are one. You know. But, yeah, they were going to turn around and try to get rid of him. But he showed care and concern. How do we live? And I'm going to get to the vision. I know you're really wanting that, so, you know. I got a whole hour. This is my last shot to get some time, you know. So, we've talked about how do you live in a world that dominates. And these guys were dominated by the Babylonian Empire.
Sort of like where we live now.
Yeah, and it's going to get more so. It's going to get more so. You can rest assured in my lifetime, your lifetime, it is going to get worse. It is not going to get better unless, you know, we get through that 7 years, then it's going to be better. Unless the rapture takes place, and it will take place about 3.5 to 4 years into it, you know, maybe a little longer than that. Yeah. I hope it is pre-tribulation. The more I read, the more I'm thinking, the more I'm convinced that we're going to go right into it. We're going to see.
David Jeremiah doesn't believe that way.
Most people don't believe that way. You know, I'm feeling kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 3. I'm kind of standing up here by myself. No, I ain't going to do that. You know, I want to be wrong too. I don't think I am, but I'd love to be wrong with that. But you know, look at some of the things that has been presented to us in the book of Daniel about how do we live in a world filled with people who hate us, who don't believe like us. And just, you know, to note, utilize the natural abilities that God has given you. Remember chapter 1, these boys were wise. They were smart. They had natural gifts and abilities and talents. Use that. If you're a good mathematician, use that.
They saw it through the proper lens, though.
Yeah, they saw it through the proper lens. Yeah,
They used those by faith,
they did.
not by fear.
Yeah, they used it by faith, not by fear.
They can say, we're scared, we gotta use our skills, do exactly what it tells us to do, and they'll take care of us. Or they can say, God, in spite of the circumstances,
Yeah,
I'm gonna stand with you in faith.
yeah.
Which is easy to step up and say, a lot harder to do in
A lot harder to do when you stand in front of a king who doesn't have any qualms about killing you, you know.
Back to what Matt said this morning.
Yeah.
about praising and
Yeah,
doing what
yeah.
in the midst of, and
Yeah.
God is blessing you beyond your understanding at some point, and you gotta get past that.
And they had to be able to see that being carried 700 miles at least from their home, never see their families, never see most of the people they knew. Their city is going to be destroyed. Their temple is going to be burnt. All of that's going to happen. And they have got to be able to still say, ain't eating that and ain't drinking that, and I will offer you a compromise. I will use tact. I will be polite. But, you know, and that's another element. You know, in surviving, we don't have to, as believers, strut around like, God, I know I'm going to win. So Daniel asked these guys, he asked Ashpenaz, could we have 10 days to eat our food? And then you make the decision as to whether we look better or not. You know, he used tact. He didn't demand, he asked. Fully willing to die if necessary, but he saw and used his tact, he used wisdom, and he was grounded in the Word. He had faith in what God was going to do.
I gotta ask, so were they enjoying the ride?
Now, and
If they were God's.
yeah, and I'd say, in light of that, and I said it to myself this morning, I don't know that I would have chosen the word enjoy the ride. I understand what he's trying to say. You rejoice in the fact that you are accomplishing something in the will of God by His power that dwells within you. And yes, you're glad that God is using you, but enjoying being beat with rods, think about being beat with a broom handle. That's the kind of rod he was beaten with. And enjoyed that? No, I don't think he did. Hit me again. No, I don't think he dared them, But he did enjoy the fact that, yes, I'm being used by God. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel, they didn't enjoy the fact that they were taken captive all the way over here. But he rejoiced. I thank and praise you. That's enjoying the ride. I thank and praise you that I ain't got to die with the rest of them. You've shown me the way through your power, that I don't have to die, my 3 friends don't have to die, and I'm going to try to help these other folks not to die. That's,
Knowing the result.
Yeah, he knew the results.
The process isn't always from.
Yeah, Daniel knew the results of this vision before the king ever validated it. The king didn't have to validate it. When Daniel goes in, and look at what he does. Daniel went to Arioch, verse 24, said, don't kill us, take me, I got it. And he goes in and tells the king, yes, okay. And the king asked Daniel, and here's a powerful phrase that happens several times in the book of Daniel. Verse 25, or verse 26. And you can just feel the twin blessing and ominous threat in this. Are you able to tell me what I saw? Are you able? That phrase comes up again in chapter 3. When Nebuchadnezzar asked the 3 Hebrews, he said, what God is able? Well, you'll find out. What God is able. Belshazzar asks again in chapter 5. He tells Daniel, I've heard that you are able. Daniel has to correct it, And then in chapter 6, Darius comes to the lion's den and he says, was your God able? The answer is still the same in all of those situations. My God is able. Yes, he is able. And so that's just a powerful, from the threat to the hope to the fear, all of these things were asked. The answer is always the same. Yes, our God is able. So, somebody had a statement or question?
This is all funneling through Daniel.
Yeah.
And Daniel's the guy speaking and everything, but it's obvious here that Daniel's very quick to answer the king's response by, no man is able to do what you're asking.
Yeah.
Only God is able to do what you're asking.
Yeah.
And really, this whole scenario thing, yes, it's about Daniel, his faith and everything, but really it's about who this God is
Yeah.
of Daniel and these Israelites.
Yeah.
And how powerful he is and
Mm-hmm.
what he's able to do. And God uses these guys to reveal to
His sovereignty.
these
Yeah.
these people who really is God.
Yeah. Yeah. That's,
Who really is in
yeah.
control, And it would have been very easy. I'm trying to put myself in Daniel's place. Man, you want to take a lot of credit.
Mhm.
But God's been able to show through, and I've been able to see this, and I've been able, and you want to tend to put that word I in there.
Oh, yeah.
But Daniel was very quick to say, no, I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
And the human part of me is thinking, wow, this guy is so in tune and so in touch with God that even he eventually gets to the point of being right up there with the king.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Advise him and everything, but still, to give credit where it's due
Mhm.
and not to fall into that, yes, and look what we were able to do, what we're able to see, and that, for me, that speaks. It opens
Oh,
my
yeah.
eyes to see, man, these guys were just about God and about
Yeah.
plan was and what his vision is, and I'm just a tool that he's using.
Yeah.
And as long as he wants to use me, he can use me, and I'm gonna give him the credit and
Yeah.
that's pretty powerful.
That is. It's amazing to think about these kids, teenagers, having this level.
It's so far from where we
Oh,
are as a
oh,
nation.
oh goodness, yeah.
I was just looking at chapter, verse 46, where Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face and pays homage to Daniel. I mean, what a dichotomy.
Yeah,
It's-
yeah. You know, this whole section, chapter 2 through chapter 4, is God's sovereignty versus Nebuchadnezzar. Round 1 goes to God. Of course, round 2 is going to go to God, and round 3 is going to go to God. You know, it's going to be a total, decision for the Lord. But Nebuchadnezzar is confronted with the awesomeness of the God of Daniel, which is the God of Israel. And he's forced to realize, yeah, I'm king, but as was told this morning, I ain't driving the bus, I ain't driving the chariot, and put it in that context, And it's just interesting. Verse 28 gives to us the key verse of this book, I think. Now, Daniel starts off, verse 27, no wise man, enchanter, magician, diviner can explain to the king the mystery. And the king might have been almost thinking, wait a minute, I've heard this before. The other wise men said nobody can do this. But Daniel follows that up really quick in verse 28. But there is a God in heaven. There is the key verse to this entire book. There is a God in heaven. You still got all your little gods all around that you're worshiping, but there's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. And this begins to tell us what this vision is about. Daniel introduces the fact that, it's the God of the Jews who knows what's going on. And he's located in a realm above earth, above you, Nebuchadnezzar. And God is the revealer of mysteries, and he has shown the king what is going to happen, not what might happen, not what possibly is going to happen, what is going to happen, as if it's already done. And he goes on to tell him that this mystery, verse 30, as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you may know the interpretation, that you may understand what went through your mind. In other words, the only reason I'm able to tell you this is because God wants me to explain to you what you saw and what it means in the future. I mean, powerful. And then Daniel begins to go ahead and explain the vision. Now, you have your handouts, if you brought them with you, and so forth. And we have, I have a little graph, a little picture of this vision. Now, you'll find different, we really don't know what the vision of the man looked like. You saw an enormous statue. Doesn't tell us how big it was, how tall it was. From chapter 3, maybe assumed it was really, really large. And it was divided up. And you'll see that. The head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass or bronze, and legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. So as you look at this, you have the four metals. And it's interesting as you look at this. And Daniel goes down, breaks it down, tells them what he saw. And he tells, verse 36, I'm dropping down to this because, the other verses are just, a breakdown of what the king dreamed. And in verse 36 says, this was a dream, and now we will interpret it. You are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power, might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them. You are that head of gold. Now, we've already talked about that there were a lot of other countries in the world. But this was the country that was involved with Israel. And that's why it starts with Nebuchadnezzar. Because Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire is the beginning of the times of the Gentiles. The beginning of the domination of Israel, of the Jews, by Gentile nations. It began with Babylon. It began with Nebuchadnezzar. That's why he was given the vision, not somebody else. That's why it starts with him. And
He could have boasted right then and said, well, God, once he realized God had to handle who this God was, he could have said, well, he's using me, he's giving me dreams. He could have really bowed up.
yeah, and he did. Chapter 3 gives a whole big old idol, of gold. Yeah. Yeah, it went to his head. It really did. And as we look at the dream is about world dominion. Babylon didn't rule the entire earth, but it did rule all the earth that made up the world of Israel and was the center of known civilization at that time. So it's not a contradiction or the ignorance of God here. That, there was still China, and there was still South America, and there were still native populations of the world. No, they were not relevant. That's why they were not included. But all that was relevant, Nebuchadnezzar was the king over. And it's interesting as you look at this, he's the only king named in the dream. Neither the king nor Daniel are given the names of the descending order of kingdoms. Just one's head of gold, then chest of armed silver, brass. That's going to come later. But it's not revealed at this. And it's interesting that God holds enough of the future so that the sinful world can't preempt or thwart God's plans. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is going to take it, and like Mike said, he's going to bow up over it, and he's going to do a whole image of gold. It's going to all go to his head. He's the head of gold, and it really went to his head. And it's interesting that Daniel reveals, as he interprets this, the time period between Babylon's rise and the coming of the kingdom of God on this earth. Now, Daniel is prophesying, he's proclaiming in about, 590 BC, give or take a couple years. And this vision is covering at least 2,500 years to this present day and beyond until Jesus comes. It's at least in the 4 primary kingdoms. It's at least covering 1,100 plus years, and that's if you just take the fall of Rome at 476 BC. If you go to the Eastern Empire, that was at 1453 AD, then these 4 cover 22 or 2,300, 2,500 years nearly. I mean, it's amazing to look at the time frame. And all this dream reveals is the quality of the materials. That's the big thing. Look at what he says. Verse 39. After you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have some strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Now, Daniel notes that the issue with these is the level of inferiority. Inferiority, I don't know if I spelled it right or not, but that's what it is. Inferiority. The next skin will be inferior. Now, the question is, what was the inferiority implied? What was the inferiority that Daniel is referring to here?
Is that Israel's getting more and more away from God and dissipating into idolatry, and that's why it goes from gold to something that's brittle and fractious?
Well, it's not so much Israel.
Okay.
Not so much Israel.
Rome?
I think that it's the integrity of the kingdom as it relates to Israel. Nebuchadnezzar, of the four empires, Nebuchadnezzar had the closest encounter, if you will, with God of the four. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, those kings in the Babylonian Empire, they had the closest connection and contact, if you will, with God. Doesn't mean they were believers, but they had the closest contact. Darius and Cyrus would be next. And even though Cyrus released the Jews to go back home, he released a lot of peoples to return to their homes. But his connection to Israel was less, and that kingdom's connection to Israel was less than Babylon's. And then after Babylon, you have Greece, Alexander the Great. The Greeks, their only real connection to Israel was the infusion of Hellenism into Greek culture and to Israel's culture. So there was no real connection between Alexander and the Greek Empire and Israel except to infuse a pagan culture into it. And Rome, of iron, they were powerful, but they had no use for Israel or for Israel's God. It was under Rome that Jesus was crucified. It was under Rome that the church was persecuted. It was under Rome that, the church was scattered. And so Rome, as you look at this, and I saw the word inferior, and I went, what is the inferiority? Because these were all powerful empires. The Medo-Persian Empire was much larger and more powerful than Babylon. The Greek Empire was much more powerful than the gold or the silver. And then, of course, Rome came on the scene and stomped them all. So where's the inferiority unless it's in the quality of the metals? And yes, iron is not as expensive as gold, but is he just talking about monetary value here? No, I think he's talking about moral integrity as it relates to God's people.
And look at where Rome is now and what Rome represents now. And most people don't have a clue what they really believe.
Oh, yeah. 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 And then it takes us down into where we are now, the iron and clay. The 10 kingdoms that will arise. And we've talked about this, and we will talk about it again. When we get into chapter 7 and chapter 9, and, we're going to dig pretty deep into it then. And we got into it in the study of Revelation. But the iron and clay, the 10 toes that come out of the continuing legacy of the Roman Empire. The interesting thing about these is that they will be part iron and part clay. Strong, brittle, never really united in any way. And, you know, you kind of wonder, well, what is he talking about this? And it's possible that the iron and clay refers to the inclusion in this, at this time, whenever that time is that these 10 kingdoms arise. That there's going to be so many different peoples, tribal entities, national entities involved, that there will not be a real single united identity in those 10 kingdoms. Just like one of the things that we are wrestling with today, people don't want to necessarily be identified as an American. American is the uniting principle of who we are as individuals. I don't care what color your skin are or where your family came from, you are Americans. But there's so many that want to try to, not be a part or not identify as being a part of this country. And it's part of what we are facing that creates some of this trouble. Who do we identify ourselves as? If we're not Americans, who are we? Christian? Well, even that's gone now. Did you see the thing? I saw it on one of my useless phone apps, news, that even the fact of Judeo-Christianity is now being removed. It's done away with. It's over in consideration of America. And he goes in, the guy that writes it goes into all of this stuff about why that has been. But, we have so divided ourselves that we have a difficulty identifying as a single nation. And we see what that's creating. I think, I can't prove it, but I think this is part of what the feet and toes are here. And I just looked at my watch and it's time for me to shut up. Yes.
One comment on that. I just watched the thing yesterday when Candace Owens was talking about the breakdown of the nuclear family as part of the Antifa movement and all this movement. And she said basically it's because if you got a breakdown of family where there's no father, no mother, no whatever, no kids, and it's a straight line, narrow line to where then you become identified or dependent upon a government. And
Yeah.
which is what the end of times is basically leading to, is
Yeah.
that one world government where
Yeah.
you are loyal and dependent to that person that's taking care of you. And when I heard her speaking those words and I was living, I was like, holy cow,
Yeah.
how much sense that makes. And now you see what's going on.
Yeah.
That's exactly what she's
Yeah.
talking about, how it's basically leading to the breakdown of the nuclear family. They don't want a father, don't want a mother, you can't be identified with anything.
There's a geneticist, and I don't know if she's still there or not, but there's a geneticist at Duke University
I saw that.
who several years ago stated that a child could, from genes and chromosomes, so have 32 parents instead of one or two, man and woman. Could have 32, because you could pull all this, and you think, who would that kid identify as?
Clinton wrote a book years ago, It Takes a Village.
Oh yeah.
And that was her intent, was to say that you don't necessarily have to have the father or mother or nuclear family. I mean, they were pushing it, this isn't new, it's just getting more vocal because the times we're in.
Yeah, because and like I've said before, I think God has given us over to a reprobate mind so that we'll believe anything we want. And that was the bell. It's time to hush. Yeah. So, thank you. Gary will teach next week. Then we'll be back and we'll pick this up the next week. Thank you.